The ecological survival module began with the kind of quiet tension that always settled over the training grounds when a new challenge was introduced. The instructors stood in a rigid line, holding trays filled with identical saplings rooted in small nutrient blocks. The alien cadets whispered among themselves, curious but not particularly concerned. Most of them expected another simple endurance task or perhaps a soil testing exercise. No one imagined anything meaningful would come from such a tiny plant. When Ryan stepped forward to receive his sapling, he paused for a moment, studying the delicate leaves and the thin trunk with a seriousness that made the instructors exchange quick glances. To everyone else, the sapling looked insignificant, but he examined it as if he had just been handed a blueprint to something drastically larger. He ran his thumb lightly across the stem, checking its moisture and firmness, and the expression on his face changed into something quietly focused. The challenge had already begun in his mind. The instructor explained the rules in a sharp voice. Each cadet was to keep the sapling alive and return in 1 week for evaluation. No external tools were provided, and no nutrient packs beyond the starter block were allowed. The instructors expected to see basic survival instincts, consistency, and awareness of natural conditions. Most cadets nodded lazily, already planning to plant the sapling anywhere convenient and leave it alone. Ryan, however, scanned the designated training zone with the eyes of someone searching for hidden variables. He looked at the ridge lines, the way the wind moved the higher grass, the dark streaks in the soil that betrayed underground water, and the flight paths of small insects that hinted at pollinator density. He wasn't thinking about survival. He was thinking about potential. When the challenge officially began, the alien cadets dispersed without urgency. Some planted their saplings in the first patch of soft ground they found. Others shrugged and dropped theirs into shallow pits, patting dirt over the roots with careless hands. Ryan moved in the opposite direction, heading deeper into the territory where the terrain dipped slightly and the humidity increased. He tested the soil with his fingers, crushing small clumps to judge texture and water retention. He smelled the earth, checked for acidity using improvised methods, and examined the thin surface roots of nearby wild plants to understand how deep the moisture settled. His sapling remained cradled against his chest, protected from shifting winds. He didn't rush, because he understood that the first decision, where to plant it, would determine everything that followed. After half an hour of scouting, he stopped at a location where the ground sloped just enough to channel rainwater without drowning the roots. He crouched down, dug a narrow but deep hole using a flat stone, and placed the sapling inside with a level of precision that made the nearby cadets glance at him with mild confusion. He adjusted the angle of the trunk so it faced the sun at a slight tilt, which would encourage stronger root formation as the plant compensated. He added small pebbles around the base to prevent erosion and spread thin strips of shredded bark over the soil to retain moisture. Every movement had intent. Every adjustment revealed that his understanding of ecosystems ran deeper than the instructors anticipated. Once the sapling was in place, Ryan remained kneeling beside it, observing how the wind passed over the leaves and how the soil compacted beneath its weight. The other cadets had already wandered off to talk or rest, assuming the task required minimal involvement. Ryan stayed, analyzing the subtle environmental interactions around the plant as if he were preparing a long-term strategy. In his mind, the sapling was not just a plant. It was the seed of an entire system waiting to be shaped. As the sun climbed higher, he began collecting materials from the surrounding terrain. He gathered dry grass that he twisted into thin ropes, not for decoration, but to create support structures for the sapling's early growth. He formed a small barrier of flexible branches around the plant to deflect larger insects and curious animals. He located a shallow stream nearby and noted the best way to redirect moisture without violating the rules. He wasn't allowed to bring tools, but he was allowed to use the environment, and he intended to use it thoroughly. By midday, the instructors passed through the zone to monitor progress. Most cadets showed only a planted sapling and a bored expression. When the instructors reached Ryan, they paused. His sapling already had a protective ring of branches, a reinforced soil bed, a moisture-preserving layer, and signs of early structural planning that suggested he had no intention of stopping at basic care. One instructor opened his mouth as if about to question the purpose of Ryan's work, but he remained silent, choosing instead to observe. Something unusual was forming, and he decided to let it unfold before intervening. When the instructors left, Ryan sat beside the sapling for several minutes, mapping out the next steps. He counted days, considered growth patterns, and imagined the territory not as a barren training zone, but as a canvas. The challenge asked him to keep a plant alive. He intended to make it thrive, expand, and become something none of the other cadets would even think to attempt. He saw a potential forest where others saw a chore. The whisper of wind through the grass seemed to confirm his direction, and he nodded to himself with a quiet resolve. As evening approached, the cadets gathered at the temporary campsite, discussing how easy the challenge appeared. Ryan remained somewhat apart, sketching simple diagrams in the dirt with a stick. Sunlight angles, water routes, natural barriers, and areas where he could encourage root spread. He studied the stars for predicted weather shifts. His expression wasn't smug or anxious. It was determined, almost serene. He understood that the instructors were testing not only knowledge, but creativity and initiative. He also understood that survival, in any ecosystem, favored those who used every resource, every moment, every breath of the landscape. When night finally settled and the cadets drifted into sleep, Ryan lay awake for a while, listening to the faint rustling of nocturnal animals and the soft movement of wind across the leaves of his sapling. He imagined how it would look in a week if he executed his plan correctly, stronger, taller, surrounded by supporting growth. He imagined a network of plants working together, feeding off carefully managed soil and water. He imagined something far beyond the assignment itself. To him, the sapling wasn't a burden. It was the beginning of a transformation. And with that thought guiding him, he finally closed his eyes, ready to begin the real work at dawn. At dawn, Ryan rose before the other cadets, driven by the precise plan he had shaped the night before. The air was cool enough that his breath appeared in faint clouds, and the ground still held the memory of night moisture. He went straight to his sapling, checking the soil with the back of his fingers. It was slightly colder than he preferred, which meant the roots had experienced a drop in temperature. He pressed lightly around the base to confirm that the soil had settled evenly and that no parts had dried prematurely. Satisfied that the plant had handled the first night well, he shifted his attention to the surrounding terrain. This day would not be about protecting one sapling. It would be about multiplying life across an area that had never seen organized growth. He began by selecting 2 young branches from the sapling that were flexible enough to survive removal. He clipped them using a sharp stone he had found the previous day, making sure the cuts were angled to encourage water absorption. Each cutting was placed into damp soil near the stream, where he had already identified a patch with strong indirect sunlight. He built a small arch of leaves over them to filter the morning rays and slow evaporation. He did not expect them to take immediately, but he understood the mechanics of early rooting. Patience and consistency mattered more than miracles. When the first 2 cuttings were secured, he moved farther into the territory to collect additional plant material. He located wild shrubs with vibrant internal moisture and stripped small sections of bark, grinding them into a pulp that he mixed with soil to act as a mild growth stimulant. He had read once that certain fibrous plants on similar worlds produced natural compounds that encouraged root branching, and he hoped this planet's flora held comparable traits. As he worked, the alien cadets occasionally passed by, watching him with amusement. Some whispered that he was overthinking the assignment, investing energy in something that would not affect the outcome. He ignored them. He knew that the instructors evaluated more than just results. They evaluated vision. By mid-morning, the first signs of expansion took shape. He returned to the sapling and gently coaxed a few surface roots outward by loosening the soil around them, allowing them more freedom to spread. This subtle intervention would encourage the sapling to produce new feeder roots, strengthening the plant and increasing its stability. He then gathered fallen seeds from nearby wild plants and buried them around the sapling in deliberate spacing patterns. His objective wasn't to create random growth, but to build layered vegetation, small, medium, and tall, so the ecosystem would evolve into a balanced cluster rather than a chaotic patch of greenery. Every placement was chosen to shape airflow, humidity retention, and light distribution. As the day grew warmer, he shifted to a new phase, grafting. He selected a thick side branch and attached a young cutting from a fast-growing local plant. He bound them tightly with grass ropes until the fibers fused against the bark. The process was delicate because the graft needed pressure, but not strangulation. If the graft succeeded, the sapling would gain characteristics from the native plant, speeding growth and increasing resilience. The instructors had never mentioned grafting, which meant it fell well within permitted creativity. While working, he monitored changes in the environment. A faint breeze carried a slightly mineral scent, which suggested that afternoon heat would dry the soil more quickly than the previous day. He adjusted by forming a shallow basin around the sapling, digging outward to create natural water-catching channels. These channels would collect dew and direct it to the roots, supplementing moisture without needing artificial irrigation yet. Each decision connected to a larger framework that he held in his mind, a forest map that only he could see. By the afternoon, several cadets wandered near him again, drawn by the increasingly organized layout of his territory. One cadet watched as he inserted a cutting into a hole lined with crushed bark pulp. She asked him what purpose the mixture served. He responded calmly that he believed it would encourage rooting. She tilted her head as if uncertain, then walked away with a strange mix of curiosity and disbelief. To her, the sapling was a task. To him, it was a catalyst. As sunlight became harsher, he erected simple shade structures for the youngest cuttings. He braided long strands of grass and wove them around slender branches to create a lattice that filtered the light just enough to protect the fragile stems from scorching. The structures swayed gently in the breeze, casting shifting shadows that kept the soil from overheating. The landscape that had once looked barren now held hints of intention, a pattern forming, subtle but unmistakable. By late afternoon, the first signs of success appeared. One of the cuttings near the stream showed a slight upward tilt, a near imperceptible change that indicated early water absorption. The leaves had regained tension, no longer drooping under their own weight. Ryan crouched beside it, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from the surrounding soil. His satisfaction was quiet, but powerful. It confirmed that his strategy was viable. If one cutting adapted, more could follow. Encouraged, he began preparing additional sites farther from the stream. He dug narrow trenches lined with pebbles to regulate drainage, knowing that future plants would need stable foundations before he expanded the forest beyond the immediate area. He crushed dried leaves into powder and mixed them with soil to create pockets of organic matter that would break down slowly, feeding the roots as they grew. He planted the second set of cuttings with meticulous spacing, envisioning where each future trunk would lift the canopy and how each leaf cluster would influence the microclimate. As evening approached again, the training grounds buzzed with quiet speculation. The instructors had toured the area earlier and exchanged murmured comments that carried more interest than reprimand. The alien cadets began to realize that something beyond the scope of the assignment was unfolding. While most of them had placed a sapling in the ground and moved on, Ryan had begun reshaping an entire ecosystem. He returned to his sapling before sunset, checking its graft, adjusting the soil again, and whispering a soft acknowledgement of the progress made that day. He traced his gaze across the territory, imagining the coming days, a place where the air would hold more moisture, where young plants would form layers of green, where life would accelerate in ways that seemed impossible within a week. The last light of day touched the horizon as he finished his work. The area around him, once empty and silent, now breathed with potential. Young cuttings rested beneath shade structures. Wild seeds waited beneath the soil, and the sapling itself stood like the core of something awakening. Ryan felt a steady sense of purpose settle in his chest. He knew what he had started, and he understood what it could become. Tomorrow he would push further, expand more, and test the limits of growth. The forest he envisioned was no longer a distant idea. It had already begun to rise from the dirt. On the third morning, Ryan felt the subtle shift in the air even before the sun rose. The breeze was warmer and drier than usual, a sign that the coming days would drain moisture faster than the plants could naturally replenish it. He knelt beside one of the new cuttings and touched the soil lightly, confirming his suspicion. The ground had already begun to crust. If he didn't act soon, the progress he had made would slow to a crawl. He needed water, not in scattered droplets or unpredictable streams, but in a controlled, predictable system that would reach every part of his expanding forest. His eyes moved toward the shallow stream that wound across the training zone. He had noticed earlier that its flow weakened at midday, likely due to evaporation and underground absorption. He followed it now, walking along the bank and studying how the water split around small stones and ridges. The stream's path was uneven, wasting precious water that seeped into unrelated patches of soil. He crouched by a bend, pressing his fingers into the mud and watching how the water pulled back slightly before continuing forward. The behavior confirmed what he needed. With careful adjustments, he could redirect a significant amount of water toward his forest without damming the stream completely. He gathered reeds first, long, hollow, flexible plants that grew near the slowest sections of the water. He cut several of them with the sharpened stone he used earlier and held them up to the light, checking for obstructions. Some were partially clogged with sediment, so he used thin twigs to clean them out, creating narrow tubes for water transport. He tested the flow by dipping one end into the stream and sucking briefly on the other, allowing the water to travel through the reed. The movement was strong enough to confirm that the tubes would serve as natural pipes. Next, he constructed a frame of interlocking branches to support the reed channels. He tied the branches with grass ropes and planted the structure firmly into the soil at an angle. When he placed the reeds along the frame, he created a raised aqueduct that carried water downhill toward the heart of the young forest. He built several of these frames, each one aligned to use gravity instead of force. The system resembled miniature irrigation lines, weaving through the terrain in quiet streams that fed the cuttings and wild seeds he had planted. As the first trickle of redirected water reached the soil near the sapling, Ryan watched the earth darken in a slow, satisfying spread. The moisture traveled directly to the roots, bypassing rocks and unnecessary absorption zones. He lifted a handful of damp soil, letting it fall between his fingers and feeling its improved consistency. It had softened, gaining the elasticity that plants required to grow rapidly. He allowed himself a breath of relief before turning to the next phase. He expanded the irrigation by digging shallow trenches that branched off from the aqueduct lines. Each trench traveled to a specific cluster of plants, guiding water like veins distributing nutrients through a living body. He filled the bottoms of these trenches with smooth pebbles, which prevented erosion and ensured steady flow. When the water reached the pebble beds, it dispersed more evenly, soaking the soil at a controlled pace. He adjusted the depth of each trench to balance the distribution so no part of the forest would drown or dry out. By midday, he felt sweat running down his back as the sun strengthened overhead. The stream level lowered slightly, confirming the importance of the adjustments he had made. He spent several hours reinforcing the most vulnerable sections of the aqueducts, weaving additional strands of grass around the reeds to prevent collapse. He pushed stakes deeper into the ground where the angles threatened to shift, and he tested the water flow repeatedly, listening to the faint trickle as it moved through the channels. Every sound reassured him that his creation was functioning. While he worked, a few alien cadets paused at a distance to observe him. One cadet frowned in confusion at the sight of the raised water channels, unsure whether such engineering was allowed or even useful. Another whispered something to her companion, pointing at the growing green patches that now stretched much farther than before. None of them approached, but their expressions revealed a dawning awareness that Ryan's approach was fundamentally different from anything they had imagined. He paid them no attention. His focus was absolute. By late afternoon, the trenches were complete, but Ryan wasn't satisfied. He wanted the forest to grow even during the night, when evaporation slowed and water could seep deeper into the ground. To achieve that, he built a series of clay collectors. He found pockets of wet clay near the stream, shaped it into shallow bowls, and placed them at intervals along the aqueduct. These bowls caught water during peak flow and released it gradually through tiny holes he had formed with a thin twig. It was a simple technique, but one that allowed moisture to remain in circulation long after the stream grew weak. When he positioned the final clay bowl, he stepped back to look at the entire system. The aqueducts curved elegantly through the terrain, their heights calculated to maintain stable pressure. The trenches extended into the emerging clusters of green, marking where new life would soon take hold. The clay collectors gleamed faintly under the afternoon sun, ready to work through the night. Everything functioned not as a collection of parts, but as a single organism he had designed with precision. As the sun dipped lower, Ryan revisited the earliest cuttings. The leaves were firmer than before, and some stems had begun to push slightly upward, signaling healthy development. The soil beneath them was cool and moist, thanks to the irrigation channels. He gently touched one of the stems and felt the faint tension that hinted at coming growth. His efforts had not just preserved the plants, they had accelerated them. He moved next to the sapling at the center of the forest. Its leaves fluttered softly in the warm breeze, and its trunk now held a stronger, steadier posture. The graft he created had not yet shown visible changes, but the bark around the binding had darkened slightly, a promising sign that the two plants had begun integrating. The sapling absorbed water more efficiently than the surrounding plants, strengthening into the anchor he had always intended it to be. When he finished checking each part of the network, he ended the day by observing how the water moved under the dimming light. The aqueducts glowed in thin streaks where the sun caught the surface. The trenches glistened as water traveled through the pebbles. The green patches pulsed with new energy, responding to the steady nourishment. Ryan felt a quiet pride settle in his chest. He had not simply built an irrigation system. He had created the first breath of a living forest. As darkness approached, he remained seated on a high patch of ground overlooking the network. He listened to the soft trickling of water, the sound of life beginning to take root in a place once considered barren. Tomorrow he would begin the next stage, strengthening the forest vertically. For that, he already had plans forming. Plans involving rope, elevated structures, and a canopy that would grow above the ground just as richly as the roots below it. By the morning of the fourth day, the young forest had reached a point where Ryan could finally shift his attention upward. The moisture in the soil was stable, the cuttings had begun to adapt with visible confidence, and the saplings stood sturdier than ever. The air held a faint scent of wet clay and growing leaves, a scent that carried the promise of a developing ecosystem. Ryan walked slowly through the expanding green, listening to the soft rustle of branches that only a few days earlier hadn't existed. He had built the foundation. Now he needed to build the structures that would lift the forest toward the sky. He chose a cluster of trees that had grown quickly near the stream-fed section of the irrigation network. They were not tall yet, but they had strong central stems and flexible branches that could support lightweight construction. He examined each tree carefully, checking the angle of the trunk, the spacing between branches, and the resilience of the bark. He pressed gently against the main stems to test their resistance, noting how much force they could handle without bending too sharply. The forest was young, but youth made it pliable. If he built wisely, the structures he created would grow together with the trees, forming a stable canopy settlement by the final days of the challenge. He began weaving ropes from the long grass that grew near the water. The grass had absorbed moisture from the irrigation system, making it softer but still strong. He twisted it tightly, then braided 3 strands into a thicker cord, repeating the process until he had a collection of ropes of different lengths. He tested each by pulling with his full strength. The longest rope held firm, flexing without tearing. It would be enough to support the platforms he planned. Next, he searched for bark panels. Some of the older shrubs on the outskirts of the forest had naturally shed their bark in large, curved sheets. He peeled a few loose sections, careful not to harm the living interior of the shrubs, and softened them by soaking them briefly in shallow pools formed by his irrigation channels. Once softened, the bark became flexible enough to shape into panels. He reinforced the edges with smaller branches and tied them securely with grass cords. Each panel formed a lightweight but sturdy plate that could serve as flooring. With materials prepared, Ryan climbed the first tree. He used one of the ropes as a harness, looping it around the trunk and pulling himself upward with careful precision. He reached a stable fork between 2 branches and sat there for a moment, observing the view of his forest from above. The young plants created a mosaic of greens that shifted subtly in the moving sunlight. The aqueducts and trenches formed patterns across the terrain that blended with the natural flow of the land. It wasn't just a forest anymore. It was a system, one that responded to his every calculation. He secured the first plank by tying the rope tightly around the supporting branches. He then placed the bark panel over the frame, adjusting its position until the weight was evenly distributed. He added another rope underneath like a sling to prevent sagging. When he stepped on the plank, it bent slightly but held, and he felt the satisfying stability of something built correctly. Encouraged, he began constructing the rest of the platform. By midday, the first treehouse base was complete. It was a simple structure, just a raised platform with reinforced edges, but it marked the beginning of a canopy settlement. The alien cadets noticed it immediately, slowing in their routines to stare at the unexpected construction. One cadet lingered longer than the others, her eyes fixed on the platform with obvious confusion. She had planted her sapling days ago and considered her task nearly done, but the sight of the platform suggested to her that the true challenge was far larger than she had imagined. Ryan acknowledged her glance with a calm nod, then continued working without pausing to explain himself. He built rope bridges next. Using the strongest grass cords, he looped the ropes between 2 trees that grew close together and tied them in a diagonal pattern to distribute tension. He created 2 parallel lines for the handrails and wove smaller strands between them to create a walkway. When the bridge was complete, it swayed with each breeze but remained secure. Ryan tested it carefully, crossing from one platform to the next. The motion was gentle, more soothing than unsettling. He knew that in a natural environment, slight flexibility was safer than rigidity. Once the bridges linked the trees, he started constructing additional platforms. Each treehouse required its own careful planning because no 2 trees grew exactly the same way. Some had branches positioned perfectly for support, while others needed extra ropes or crossbeams. He adapted to each tree's structure, weaving the platforms into the natural curves of the trunks. He wanted the settlement to blend seamlessly into the forest, as though the trees themselves had shaped the structures. As the afternoon sun reached its highest point, Ryan paused to drink from a leaf cup he had crafted earlier. He sat on the edge of the highest platform and studied the settlement from above. Rope bridges formed pathways between the trees like veins connecting living limbs. The bark panels created gentle curves that followed the contours of the branches, giving the treehouses a harmonious, almost organic appearance. The forest swayed beneath him, rustling with soft rhythms that matched his breathing. He wasn't finished yet. He wanted shelters that could withstand the wind and protect against potential rain. He collected large leaves with waxy surfaces and wove them into mats. He laid these mats over the platforms in angled patterns to create roofs that allowed rain to run off easily. He reinforced the roofs with thin branches bent into arches, tying them securely with grass ropes. The final appearance resembled natural nests rather than artificial structures, exactly as he intended. As evening approached, the forest settlement was nearly complete. The platforms rested among the branches like floating islands, connected by bridges that swayed gently in the amber light. The irrigation channels below shimmered with the last reflections of the sun, feeding the forest with a steady, quiet pulse. Ryan descended one of the ladders he had built and walked through the forest floor, looking upward at the structures he had created. The settlement didn't just exist above the ground, it elevated the entire environment, giving the forest a second layer of life. He ended the day by climbing the tallest platform and sitting beneath the woven roof. The forest stretched out around him, alive with the sounds of insects drawn to the moisture and animals attracted by the new greenery. The sunset illuminated the young leaves in gold and orange, transforming the settlement into something that looked almost ancient, as if it had always belonged there. Ryan rested with his back against a trunk, his hands relaxed, his breathing slow. Tomorrow would be the final test of what he had built, and he intended to meet it with the same calm determination that had carried him this far. The settlement around him would stand, grow, and flourish, because he had shaped it with intention and respect for the land. Ryan awoke on the final morning before the evaluation, with the soft glow of sunlight filtering through the woven leaf roof above him. The gentle warmth carried with it an unusual calmness, as if the forest sensed that its moment of recognition had arrived. He stretched slowly, listening to the faint hum of insects already moving through the undergrowth and the whisper of water flowing through the irrigation channels beneath the platforms. Every sound reminded him of how much life had emerged in such a short time. He descended from the treehouse and walked across the dew-damp forest floor, pausing to check the firmness of the soil, the state of the cuttings, and the strength of the branches supporting his platforms. Everything responded with resilience, as though the forest had matured years instead of days. He approached the sapling at the heart of his creation and brushed his fingers across its now broad leaves. The trunk had thickened noticeably, showing the early signs of a tree that would one day tower above others. The graft he had made days earlier had integrated beautifully, and a branch from the native plant had begun forming tiny buds of its own. The sapling, once fragile, now pulsed with energy. For Ryan, it was the clearest symbol of what he had accomplished. He knew the forest could speak for itself during the evaluation, but he still felt a quiet urge to prepare it one last time. He adjusted a few shade structures, replaced a loose rope on one of the bridges, and smoothed the soil where a small animal had dug overnight. He wanted every detail to reflect the care he had poured into this place. By midday, distant voices signaled the approach of the instructors and cadets. Ryan returned to the central clearing, standing among the trees he had nurtured. He watched the others arrive in small clusters, each carrying a single sapling in hand or guiding the instructors toward a lone plant that had survived the week. The difference between their efforts and his forest was striking enough that whispers began spreading through the group. One cadet stopped in her tracks when she saw the rope bridges overhead. Another looked around, baffled, trying to understand how the once barren landscape had transformed into layered greenery. Even the instructors hesitated briefly at the tree line, uncertain whether they were meant to step into the dense vegetation or wait for clarification. One instructor, a tall alien with silver markings across his face, stepped forward first. His eyes widened as he scanned the canopy, then the platforms, then the intricate irrigation lines that glistened beneath the trees. He blinked several times as if attempting to reset his perception. He had expected a sapling. He had not expected a functioning micro-ecosystem with engineered water flow, vertical structures, and interconnected habitats. He motioned for the other instructors to follow, and they entered the forest with slow, careful steps, as though afraid to disturb something delicate. The forest, however, responded with calm acceptance, its branches swaying gently in greeting. Ryan guided them toward the central sapling, speaking only when necessary. He explained the placement of each trench, the purpose of the aqueducts, and the reasoning behind the layered planting system. He pointed out the cuttings he had cloned, the wild seeds he had cultivated, and the grafting techniques that had accelerated the primary tree's growth. The instructors moved through the space almost reverently, tracing their fingers along the reinforced bark panels of the platforms, studying the bridges with fascination, and crouching to test the soil for themselves. One instructor dipped her hand into a clay collector, letting the remaining water flow over her palm. Her expression shifted into one of astonishment as she realized how slowly the water released itself into the ground. When the group reached the treehouse settlement, the reaction intensified. An instructor stepped onto the lowest platform, pressing his foot down carefully. The structure held without strain. He tested the ropes, touched the woven leaf roof, and stared upward at the next platform with disbelief spreading across his face. He asked Ryan how long it had taken to build each one, and Ryan explained his process calmly, describing how he shaped each structure around the natural strengths of the tree rather than forcing the tree to adapt to the structure. This answer left the instructor speechless. The cadets behind him exchanged looks of mixed admiration and shock. The evaluation, meant to be swift, stretched into a long, exploratory tour. The instructors inspected every part of the forest, the root systems strengthened by controlled moisture, the layout of the trenches, the placement of plants according to sunlight distribution, and the elevated shelters that blended into the canopy. The deeper they walked, the clearer it became that Ryan had not merely exceeded expectations. He had redefined the meaning of the assignment itself. Finally, the lead instructor returned to the central clearing and addressed the group. He spoke with a firmness that carried both authority and awe. He stated that the original assignment had been designed to test basic ecological responsibility. The cadets were expected to keep a sapling alive using minimal intervention. What Ryan had done, however, belonged to an entirely different category of skill. He had demonstrated not only an understanding of plant survival, but also environmental engineering, biological adaptation, structural design, and long-term ecosystem planning. The instructor paused, searching for the right words, then admitted openly that he had never seen a cadet produce results of this magnitude in so little time. Several cadets lowered their heads, embarrassed by the comparison. Others stared at Ryan with a new kind of respect, recognizing that his achievement had arisen not from arrogance, but from vision. One instructor commented that he would need to revise the training manuals because the current standards could no longer accommodate what Ryan had shown was possible. Another suggested that the Academy consider adding an advanced ecological engineering module inspired by the techniques Ryan had displayed. When the evaluation concluded, the instructors formally declared Ryan's project an exemplary model worthy of long-term preservation. They decided to leave the forest intact, allowing it to grow naturally after the cadets departed. The settlement he built would remain as a training landmark, a living reminder of what a single sapling could become when placed in the right hands. The instructors asked Ryan if he wished to give a final statement, but he simply shook his head and looked up at the canopy with a quiet smile. His work was already speaking for him. As the sun began to set, casting warm orange light through the leaves, Ryan climbed one of the rope bridges and stood on the highest platform. From there he could see the entire forest stretching beneath him, the sapling that had become a tree, the cuttings that would soon form a grove, the irrigation system pulsing with life, and the shelters resting peacefully among the branches. The cadets gathered below, still absorbing the reality of what had unfolded. The instructors whispered among themselves, clearly planning updates to future training programs. Ryan inhaled the cool evening air and felt a deep sense of completion settle in his chest. He had not built the forest to impress anyone. He had built it because he saw possibility where others saw limits. The challenge had not been about survival, it had been about creation. Now, as the forest grew stronger with each passing moment, he understood that his experiment had already outgrown him. It would continue shaping the land long after he left, evolving into something even he could not predict. With that realization, he descended the platform slowly and walked toward the edge of the forest. The trees rustled softly, almost as if thanking him,